These asylums have sat abandoned for decades, their legacies of horrible mistreatment trapped within their walls.
These are the stories of some of the most notorious abandoned mental asylums in the world. In 1925, the Forest Haven Asylum opened its doors in Laurel, Maryland. The campus was 250 acres and it boasted 30 buildings. Patients, then referred to as inmates, were taught job skills in a communal environment that empowered them emotionally and mentally and boosted their physical health as well. The institution was revolutionary until it wasn't. You know how the story goes. Funding gets cut, staff gets cut, or replaced with unqualified personnel, conditions worsen, and the entire facility begins to fall into a dangerous state of disrepair. What's worse is that as things got worse, many members of staff began taking their frustrations out on their patients, either ignoring them completely, leaving them to die of their various ailments, causing them physical harm, including scalding them with hot water, or even violating them sexually. Eventually, bodies began to pile up on the grounds, some of which had been subjected to medical experiments prior to their deaths. The bodies were buried in a field in shallow, unmarked graves with a single headstone to represent the lot.
Severals Hospital in Essex, England finally closed its doors in 1997, and it's sat abandoned ever since. Its history is just as dark as the now empty corridors. It opened in 1913 to treat patients with mental illness, which back then included a pretty broad gamut of people. Too broad. People were housed here for all sorts of irrational reasons. Even women who'd been victims of SA could be sent here, or women who had given birth to illegitimate offspring. For some reason, it was just decided that they needed to be separated from society, and it was often their own families who would commit them. On top of all the ill practices, which I'll get to in a moment, this place was also bombed in World War II. 38 patients in the hospital's West Wing were killed in 1942 when the Germans dropped 3 bombs on the grounds. Many of the patients were buried nearby. In the 50s, new quote-unquote treatments started being implemented, like frontal lobotomies and electroconvulsive therapy. It was completely inhumane, especially, again, when you consider how many patients were here for reasons we'd think are just unimaginable today.
In 1911, the small village of Thiels, New York, located about 40 miles north of Manhattan, was chosen as the grounds of Letchworth Village Asylum, an experimental asylum that had plans of dedicating the entire village to the mentally ill. 2,000 patients, 2,000 acres, and over 130 buildings. The goal was to create a place where patients could live freely and experience a full life. Unfortunately, the institution became vastly overcrowded almost immediately, which led to a shortage in funds, which in turn led to a shortage in staff, which culminated in the gross mistreatment of the patients who had come or been sent to the asylum in hopes of a better life. In the mid-1900s, unbeknownst to the patients, the facility began using them as guinea pigs to test the new polio vaccine, which is likely why the asylum was allowed to exist for so long despite the treacherous conditions and the routine mistreatment of the patients. In 1996, the facility shut its doors after a series of successful human rights campaigns outlawed the unethical practices as well as the abysmal living conditions of the asylum. When all was said and done, more than 900 shallow graves, most of them small in size, if you know what I mean, were found hidden in a forest next to the asylum.
North Wales Hospital was the first mental hospital in the country, completing its construction in 1848. It only closed down in 1995. That is a lot of history. It had first been built to house just 200 patients, but by 1899, there were as many as 1,500. The intention behind the hospital was admirable. They didn't want it to be like the workhouses of the time, which were basically just dumping grounds where people who'd been cast out or forgotten by society would do hard labor. Instead, they wanted it to be a place of restorative treatment. Unfortunately though, like with so many of these places, it ended up degrading into the exact type of system it had originally set out to replace. Patients' well-being was mostly set aside, and many of the tasks at the facility were carried out by them. They'd basically become custodians of the hospital.
In 1888, Volterra Psychiatric Hospital was founded in Volterra, Italy, as an asylum for the mentally ill. The plan was to create a completely functioning and closed society for those suffering from ailments of of the mind. The society would have its own shops, agricultural companies, its own judicial system, and even its own currency. That was the plan, at least. In 1902 and the years that followed, many new patients arrived at the facility, and many new buildings were erected to accommodate them. By the 1950s and 60s, the asylum had become one of the largest in Italy, but there was something sinister going on behind the scenes. At the first sign of depression, schizophrenia, or even an unwillingness to conform to societal norms, patients were treated with isolation, electroshock therapy, insulin-induced comas, pills, and literal poison. Furthermore, nurses and doctors were not required to communicate a patient's treatment plan to their family members. The institution closed its doors in 1978 after Italy mandated the regulation of compulsory medical treatments, but prior to the closure, one patient left a very prominent mark on the outer walls of the Volterra Psychiatric Hospital. Hundreds of carvings etched into the stone exterior of the buildings. A long story told by one man, Nanetti, who was a prisoner at the asylum for many years before eventually being moved to a regulated hospital and finally being laid to rest in 1994.
Building 25 of the Creedmoor Psychiatric Center has sat abandoned for decades. It's one of the grimiest places I've ever seen on one of these lists, gotta say. The Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, New York is actually still in operation today, aside from Building 25, which closed in the early 70s. And it looks like it closed in the early 70s. As you probably know, New York in the 70s was basically a gang-infested war zone, and the bad stuff even extended to this hospital. The place saw 22 violent crimes, 130 burglaries, 52 fires, a riot, multiple reports of SA, and all of this happened within the span of about 20 months. I'm guessing a lot of the action happened in Building 25, which is why it was sealed off. It was never sold either. It's just been sitting there collecting pigeon crap, literally. Apparently, there's a lot of it. One spot has a mountain of it several feet high.
In 1878, the Danverse State Lunatic Asylum opened its doors atop a hill in Danverse, Massachusetts. Originally made to be a self-sustaining establishment with several treatment amenities on site designed to fully cure patients of their ailments, the facility was equipped to house 450 patients, but soon it was home to more than 2,000 individuals suffering from various mental disorders. Patients would often be seen walking around the facility naked and covered in filth, and soon the treatment methods became more and more barbaric and invasive. Electroshock therapy and poorly performed lobotomies became the norm. Patients who underwent these treatments often died, or just ended up worse off than they were when they entered the asylum. And when these practices failed, patients were restrained and forced to live out the rest of their days roaming the dilapidated halls of the asylum in straitjackets. In 1939 alone, 278 patients died as a result of prefrontal lobotomies. The facility began shutting down in 1985, but it didn't fully close until 1992. When all was said and done, the Danverse State Lunatic Asylum was essentially just a place where the mentally ill went to be tormented and to die.
Rolling Hills Asylum opened in 1826 as a working farm for the poor, but soon a whole swath of different people would be housed here, including widows, orphans, and the mentally ill. Around 1,700 deaths were reported here, but many more were never even documented. The building has become rather infamous for its hauntings. The scariest spirit is said to be that of Emmy, a cruel nurse who is said to have worked in the infirmary wing. Patients and even other staff were terrified of her. She seemed to take this sick pleasure in tormenting patients and was even rumored to practice black magic.
In 1888, the Fernald State Asylum in Waltham, Massachusetts opened its doors. It didn't take long before it earned itself the reputation of being one of the most despicable facilities of its kind, likely due to the fact that the hospital, if you can even call it that, was known largely for its fondness of illegal radiation testing. While the hospital was originally designed to house the mentally ill, the third superintendent, Walter E. Fernald, eventually decided to admit patients who were either poor or simply unwanted in society because he believed in selective breeding and didn't want those kinds of people to participate in growing the population in any way, shape, or form. The asylum became overcrowded and living conditions began taking a downward spiral. And then the 1940s rolled around, which is when researchers from Harvard and MIT, funded by the Quaker Oats Company, began exposing patients to small doses of radiation to test their absorption of the toxic energy. Eventually, the radioactive chemicals were injected into patients under false pretenses. More than 295 patients died during their time in the asylum. In the 1970s, a lawsuit forced the facility to cease their illegal testing, rectify the conditions of the hospital, and bring the facility up to a humane standard. And in 1989, MIT and Quaker Oats settled in a class action lawsuit regarding the radiation tests. But believe it or not, the facility didn't officially shut down until early 2014, at which time the few patients left under the hospital's care were relocated to other facilities in the state.
The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, possibly the most infamous abandoned mental asylum in the world. It was founded in 1863. By 1938, it was way over capacity, housing 6 times more patients than it was originally built for. Patients didn't even have their own rooms. They were packed together, sometimes 6 patients to a single bed. It was chaotic and unsanitary with no heating, although you probably wouldn't need heating being in a bed with 6 other people. That is horrific. The place got so out of control that patients would often just roam the halls totally unsupervised, and not only were patients being neglected, but the building itself was falling apart. One of the most nightmarish parts of the facility, though, was the experimental lobotomy lab run by a man named Walter Freeman. He was a one-man lobotomy factory. He performed thousands of lobotomies using his so-called ice pick method, which was really just a quick and easy but brutal way of performing a lobotomy. They were done without anesthesia and often outside of an operating room. He'd found a way for psychiatrists to perform the lobotomy anytime and anywhere. What an achievement to be remembered for. Reports of the mistreatment and neglect started surfacing around 1949, but the asylum only closed its doors in 1994.
Well, that's horrific.
It is. I'm always surprised every time we do an asylum list how many of these places didn't close until like the mid-90s.
Yeah.
It's really surprising.
In some cases, the 2010s. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, God. Anyway, folks, with all that said, we've been your hosts, and we'll catch you in the next video.
Cheers, friends.